Pressure mounts on the government to send legislative instrument on office of special prosecutor to parliament on the day Martin Amedu made headlines, revealing how he has been rendered utterly hopeless in doing his job. Tonight, the opposition NDC says the treatment of Martin Amedu betrays the president's lack of commitment to fighting corruption.
The president has continued to embarrassingly embarrass us as one as a country and also maybe himself in terms of his claim of fight against corruption. We have never witnessed the level of corruption we are witnessing now in the fourth Republican constitutional government.
This is Top Story with Evans Mensah.
And Top Story is always brought to you by Bond, CIMG Savings and Loans Company of the Year, Gasem Cement, the Nation Builder, Vodafone, the future is exciting, ready, and Nationwide Medical Health Insurance, Best Health Insurance Company of the Year at the 2018 Ghana Insurance Awards, and its CEO awarded Woman of Excellence at the Ghana Insurance Awards. Now, there is pressure on government tonight to send to Parliament the much-needed legislative instrument that will fully operationalize the office of the Special Prosecutor. Martin Amedu has already stirred controversy, revealing in an article that his office has been crippled due to lack of funds. In fact, he says the situation has left him in a position of, quote, utter hopelessness. This is not the first time Mr. Amedu had publicly complained. A couple of months back, he did not mince words in detailing how the absence of the legislative instrument is affecting his work.
I have been in office for 7 months. There is no legislation for me to recruit. There is no legislation for me to operate. I don't have the component of staff, and therefore I have just a core component of staff. I just received 3 investigators, an inspector, a sergeant, and a corporal on Monday, and yet the public is baying. What is he doing? He's not catching the people. In any case, you just don't walk onto the street and say, your face looks like corruption. I've caught you. I'm saying this for the public to understand that we have set up an office. We have to organize that office, have the requisite personnel. It doesn't take 1 day. My law says that 90 days after the assumption of office of the Special Prosecutor, pursuant legislation must be enacted. As we speak today, I have no legislation. So I use my common sense. I have warned that if most of these things were not done by the middle of this year, then this office may not be able to be seen to be doing its mandate by middle next year. Because by middle next year, you are in election year. If I arrest somebody, you will turn up and look at it. Which party does he hold the insurance card from?
Well, to address his concerns, the Deputy Chief of Staff, Abu Jinapo, made this promise.
As I speak to you, the draft legislative instrument is ready. It will be one of the first instruments that the Attorney General will lay before Parliament when Parliament resumes in October. And so government commitment in establishing this institution of the Office of Special Prosecutor is unflinching and total.
We'll speak to him shortly and get an update on what has happened to that promise. But my colleague, parliamentary correspondent Joseph Gakpo, joins me in the studio. Why is this bill important?
And so when you look at the Special Prosecutors Act, the Act 959, the Office of the Special Prosecutors Act 2007, there's a specific portion on it, the 78 section. It makes the point that the minister shall within 90 days upon assumption of office of a special prosecutor in consultation with the board by a legislative instrument make regulations, as in the legislative instrument. And these are the specifics that the LI is supposed to cover. The LI is supposed to provide generally for the effective implementation of this act. That's down the bottom there. And then it says that this legislative instrument is even supposed to prescribe the procedure for the submission of complaints to the Office of the Special Prosecutor, which then gives the indication that probably all the complaints that have already gone are not per the required laws.
Okay, we've seen the complaints relating to BOST and others. People have sent complaints already, but without the legislation, you can't tell whether the right procedure had been followed in submitting that complaint.
Exactly the case. So that's very fundamental that this LI has to pass before those procedures will be known, and then the whole processes can then kick in. It's also supposed to help regulate the management of seized, restrained, or confiscated assets, and the law itself gives power to the Office of the Special Prosecutor to be able to do that, and that's supposed to be clearly spelled out in the legislative instrument. It's supposed to provide for the procedure when it comes to seizure of tainted property. It's also supposed to provide for the necessary procedure when it comes to enforcement of orders, when it comes to the freezing of assets of people who are suspected to have engaged in any corrupt act. And as indicated earlier, generally when it comes to how the special prosecutor needs to do his job, this LI will be.
So is the LI in Parliament?
From what you've gathered, no, it's not been done yet. It's not been laid yet. Now, even before a legislative instrument is laid, there is a practice in Parliament. You know that usually when an LI is laid, it needs to stay in the House for a number of days, after which it matures. It doesn't come to the floor for any debate or anything like that. So before the LI is actually laid officially, there is usually what is described as the pre-laying consultation, where the organization bringing the LI would meet with members of the subsidiary legislation committee chaired by Mahama Yariga, and then they would cross all the T's and suggest necessary corrections for all of that to be done before the document would eventually be brought to Parliament. From what we gather, even the draft to allow for the pre-laying consultation has not been brought for that to be done, to then allow for the real laying itself. So about 2 weeks after the House resumed its sitting, the LI hasn't been brought yet.
Thankfully, we can speak to the Deputy Chief of Staff, Abu Junapo, joins us on the line now. Mr. Junapo, thank you for your time here on Top Story.
Thank you very much, Evans, and thank you for having me. Very good evening to your cherished listeners.
Where's the LI, do you know?
Well, Evans, I have established contact with the Attorney General's office, and I've been reliably informed that the Special Prosecutor's Operations Regulations 2018 has been submitted to Parliament. I have also checked with the President's Minister responsible for Parliamentary Affairs, the Honorable Chairman Sabonsu, and he confirms what the Attorney General has told me. So I can confirm to you that my checks from the Attorney General's office indicates to me that the LI has been submitted.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you know when this was done?
I am not in the office currently. So, I mean, I've asked for documentation and all of that. I've not been able to check specifically which date, but she tells me categorically that it's been submitted, and I can work with that.
And I know you spoke about this. You're expecting this to make a substantial difference. How much of a difference will this make once it matures in 21 working days?
Well, it should make a lot of difference because, like your correspondent rightly explained, the LI pursuant to the provisions of the Act, the Enabling Act for the establishment of the Office of Special Prosecutor, is what really will regulate the operations and affairs of the Special Prosecutor's Office, as in recruitment, mode of investigation. The general workings of that office will be within the confines of this LI. So once the LI is passed successfully, hopefully Parliament, as usual, will deal with it expeditiously. If that were completed, the office will then have, if you want, its Bible to work with. Now, Evans, if you allow me, let me reiterate that the President and his government commitment to fighting corruption is unflinching. And the President's commitment to the establishment of this office is substantial. It is not form. It's not mere rhetoric. It's not propaganda. It's not political scoring. The President genuinely believes that we need an office such as this, which is independent of all arms and organs of the government, to specifically deal with corruption. And therefore, the processes leading to the establishment of this office are being dealt with out of good faith and in the national interest. But I must also admit that having been very much involved in the establishment of this office, I have come to learn that establishing an institution such as this from scratch, if you want establishing a police force or establishing YOCO or establishing any investigative body work itself from scratch, takes some time and comes with some burden. But no matter, regardless of that, the government is very committed to seeing to the full establishment of this office. There is a lot of correspondence between the Attorney General's Department and other stakeholders in this exercise. Thankfully, the LI has been submitted to Parliament. We are very confident that Parliament, as usual, will deal with it expeditiously and dispassionately. And hopefully we have an LI which will govern the affairs of the Office of Special Prosecutor.
And as my parliamentary correspondent stated just before we spoke to you, the LI may have been submitted to Parliament, but has not been laid. There are two different things. The laying is when the counting starts for it to mature. And from what he says, it hasn't been laid. Chairman Sambusu may have it, but for the process to begin, it has to be laid. That hasn't happened.
Well, first of all, it will not even be addressed to the majority leader. My learning is that it will be addressed to the Clerk of Parliament. Secondly, like your correspondent rightly pointed out, Parliament has its own internal mechanisms for dealing with issues which can befall it, and therefore one can only urge and hope that it is given the needed attention and dealt with as priority. But as you also know, Parliament has been sitting for just 2 weeks, barely 2 weeks, and Parliament has a whole lot also to deal with. I'm not about to venture into the workings of Parliament and what has happened with it in Parliament so far. But I'm hopeful, and from the way Parliament is worked over the years, I believe that it will be dealt with accordingly. But the point I'm making essentially is that the Attorney General, having submitted it to the Clerk of Parliament, really will not have control over how it is dealt with by Parliament.
And so the hope is that the clerk, now that it's submitted to Parliament, the clerk will take the process, will go through the processes to lay it as quickly as possible so it can mature in 21 days before this Parliament goes on recess in December. Is that government's expectation?
That is our expectation, our absolute expectation. And we have a very capable and efficient minister responsible for parliamentary affairs, and government is confident that with his involvement and with the goodwill that Parliament has shown so far with its dealings relating to government business, we should have this LI through before Parliament were to rise at the end of its session on 21st of December.
Final question. Martin Amidu has written an article in which he's complaining that he's still being starved of funds. In fact, he says he's been rendered utterly hopeless. What's government's reaction to this persistent complaint we hear from him? This is second in a year that he's being starved of funds and the resources to work.
First of all, I've read Mr. Martin Amidu's article, and I'm not too sure that this is the interpretation of a journalist who wants to make some news out of it. That's fine. It's not a problem. Whatever issues that Mr. Amidu has raised are within his right to do so. And I'm not too sure that Mr. Amidu raises these issues out of bad faith. I think he raises them out of good faith with a passionate and burning desire to see to the full establishment of this office and the fight against corruption is one of the key reasons why the president appointed him in any event. That is a man who speaks his mind, who has an independence of spirit and mind, and bold and courageous, and he felt that he can deal with the issues as they are. So I don't personally, and government doesn't really find Mr. Amidu raising issues objectionable per se, except to say, Evans, that in all of these, we work within a certain constraint of budget itself, constraint of the public purse, constraint of laws, regulations, and processes that government itself has to go through. If government, for instance, wanted to purchase a vehicle for the Office of Special Prosecutor. I'm just saying, government will still have to go through procurement processes. It takes time. It can be frustrating sometimes. We all acknowledge that. There is a bureaucracy to deal with. But I can also say to you that the Office of Special Prosecutor is such an important institution for the president and the government that a lot of attention is being paid to it, even sometimes by the president himself when the need arises. So there's absolute prioritization of matters relating to and or in connection with the Office of Special Prosecutor. Now, the issue of funds and the rest, the budget is being prepared, I'm told, and the Office of Special Prosecutors' needs are being considered seriously by the Ministry for Finance, and I believe that in the long run we will go through the motions and establish an office which is fit for purpose and which will serve the Ghanaian people well.
Yeah, and you having said that though, so when you hear him say in his article, and I'm quoting here, it also reminds me of the almost utter hopelessness in which the newly established Office of the Special Prosecutor finds itself almost a year after the president caused its establishment as his flagship and vision to fight corruption in Ghana with an overwhelming national consensus and support. When you hear him say that in his article, is he justified?
Well, I'm not too sure about justified or not justified, and I'm not particularly interested in delving into the justification or otherwise of such a statement. What I do know is that government is fully committed to the establishment of this office, number one. Number two, Evans, is that in all that we do with the establishment of this office, as is the case for every other business of government, we are having to work within certain laid down legal constraints and parameters, and therefore, a year down the line, if we take stock, we will come to the point where a lot has been done. I'm not about to go through the entire narrative, and I do know, for instance, even before the board of the Special Prosecutor were to be constituted, the Deputy Special Prosecutor ought to have been appointed and vetted by Parliament. At the time when she was appointed, Parliament was on recess, and therefore we had to wait for another month or two before Parliament resumes and vets her and approves her for the board to be constituted. You cannot have an ally until you have a board in place, because the law that establishes the Office of Special Prosecutor enjoins the Attorney General to consult the board. And all of these things eats away time, but for good reason. For good reason why Parliament passed the law in the way that it is, which is to ensure that the Office of Special Prosecutor is fully independent. So Parliament, in its wisdom, did not vest powers in the Attorney General, for instance, to lay an airline for the operations of the Special Prosecutor as of right, but requested of her to consult the board of the Office of Special Prosecutor in order to ensure that the office makes input in the formulation of this airline. So the point I'm making is that Honorable Martin Amidu, in terms of his frustration and his eagerness and how much he's in a hurry to take on the issues of corruption and the rest, he's justified in that respect, and I admire him for that passion. But what has brought us this far, for good reason, certain processes ought to be adhered to, and that's what government has been up to. But I must conclude by reiterating and doing so forcefully that the president and the government's commitment to the establishment of this office is unflinching and total, and is to outlive the president and his government and the current special prosecutor and all of us, and serve generations upon generations in our country. So we are seeking to establish a full office fit for purpose for the good of this country, for dealing with corruption.
I'm grateful that you joined us. That's a Deputy Chief of Staff, Abu Jinapor there. Joseph, explain to me. He says, it's in its clarity, you told us, and that has been corroborated, that laying it, that LI hasn't been laid. He said has been submitted, but there's a difference between submitting it to the clerk and actually laying it. And there's a whole process that this has to go through.
Exactly. So laying it involves it happening at a time when the House is sitting, and then the long title of the document will be read. The minister,
on the floor?
On the floor.
Okay.
And then the minister would be mentioned. She'll acknowledge her presence, bow, and then give the indication that she's there to lay the document, and then the document would have been assumed to have been laid on the floor, and then the counting can begin. So yes, now he tells us it's been submitted, so that laying itself has to happen. But as I indicated earlier, particularly with subsidiary legislations, what happens is when it's brought to the House, there is no debate on it. Amendments cannot be made to it. It's either the House is rejecting the legislative instrument or accepting it. So procedurally, what usually happens with legislative instruments is that when it's brought, it's referred to the subsidiary legislation committee. They look at it. If Parliament wants to make any amendments, wants to make any adjustments, it's done. And then the back and forth happens between the Subsidiary Legislation Committee and the Office of the Attorney General. It's called pre-laying consultation. And it's only when a final document is ready that it's brought eventually, and then the laying is done.
I see. So between the submission and the laying, all these consultations will have to happen.
Yes, except that it's more like a convention. It's not exactly stipulated in any legal document,
but that can delay the process of laying.
Yes, that pre-laying consultation has to happen.
Okay.
Which means that if they want to push it, they can decide to skip that and lay it, and when it matures, then they get going. But then on any normal day, we would see a situation of it going through the pre-laying consultation.
Okay. Let's speak to Mr. Enusa Fuseni, who is with the Committee on Constitutional and Legal Affairs, joins us on the telephone line right now. Mr. Fuseni, I'm grateful that you joined us here on Top Story. He had the Deputy Chief of Staff. He says they've submitted the LI to Parliament. The clerk is in possession and has taken custody of it. But the question remains whether Parliament can, will this pass, mature before you go on recess, knowing what the process entails?
Well, thank you, Evans, for this opportunity to speak to the procedure of laying legislative instruments in Parliament, and to say that presently we are unaware of the legislative instrument in Parliament. But working with the explanation given by the Deputy Chief of Staff, we will only be able to ascertain whether or not the legislative instrument has arrived in Parliament tomorrow, when it is so late.
But that then raises the question, if it's not laid, and that's my colleague has explained, it begs the question, once it's laid, it has to count. But even that, the consultations have to happen. Can all this be done within the time you have before you go on recess? Because Matamidu wants this urgently.
So. Even if it is to be laid tomorrow, we have 6 weeks to go for the Christmas break. And within the 6 weeks, we have 4 days a week, and so that's 24 days. A legislative instrument must travel 21 sitting days in Parliament. And presently, as I speak to you, from tomorrow we'll have 24 sitting days in Parliament. And so, for me, we have to see whether or not the legislative instrument is in Parliament. In any case, what Martin Hamidu has been saying should be taken seriously. Because, like I said earlier, when you called me the first time, that I engaged with the Deputy Chief of Staff, what Martin Hamidu is trying to do is to manage our expectations and clearly point to the direction of responsibility and probably exonerate himself from the blame game if he is unable to work. So we should look at all these things.
Can he do that, though? Can he exonerate himself from the blame game?
He definitely will do that. If you read his recent articles, he's saying that, look, taking the Whittaker experience, you establish it's like wine. Macbeth said Shakespeare said in Macbeth, it creates the desire and takes away the performance. And so that's what they have done. They have created the desire to fight corruption, but have taken away the performance. And so you come back to the same position, square one. So he's trying to give us notice, put us on notice, and also prepare us to accept an eventual outcome that he's unable to work by reason of many conditions, one of which is the enabling legislation, Two, we had worked strenuously to ensure some modicum of financial autonomy. Matamid is saying that it appears that is not working because he's starved of funds. So these are very, very important observations by Matamid, and they are serious concerns.
We just heard the Deputy Chief of Staff say that the President's commitment to fight corruption is unflinching and total. With all that we've just said, you agree with that statement?
Well, you see, in law, we say justice must not only be seen to be done, but must manifestly be seen to be done. So the evidence of fighting corruption must be seen in the things that this government is doing preparatory to fighting corruption. And Matamid, by the account of Matamid, nothing is being done. And so that speaks to the nature of commitment of the President.
I'm grateful that you joined us. Yunus Afuseni is with the Committee on Constitutional and Legal Affairs. Let's speak to a man who once led the Ghana Integrity Initiative, the former head of the GRI. Vitus Azim joins us on the telephone line. Mr. Azim, I'm grateful that you joined us. In Martin Amidu's recent article, which has been grabbing the headlines today, he talks about the role of civil society to ensure that a fight against corruption. He says, here in Ghana, I see the absolute need for all citizens, particularly the electorate who brought the president personally to power, to support him to ensure his promise is kept. It also means that he says there's a missing link, but he wants to see more from civil society. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that there's so much that the civil society can do, and I some of it may not be possible. And so he cannot depend on civil society. Civil society can give him the necessary support, but at the end of the day, the action will be taken by the executive.
And so you talk about executive, but we just heard from the executive saying to us, the Deputy Chief of Staff, that look, there are resource constraints, and that is the reality. There are rules you need to follow, even in disbursing funds. Allies will have to go to Parliament and wait for 21 working days. Are these excuses you accept?
No, because you see, the act was passed at the end of 2017, and the president signed it first working day of 2018. So one would assume that there would have been a budget already for the Office of Special Prosecutor for 2018. So I don't think that there's any new LI that should go for the funds to be released. Now, but the LI that would enable the Office of Special Prosecutor to work, how long is it taking for this to happen? They told us when Parliament was in recess that it was with the Attorney General, with the Office of Special Prosecutor. We've now gone there. They have returned it to the Attorney General, and still we're not hearing that it has been laid before Parliament. But even as your person was speaking, if it was laid tomorrow, we still have up to 21 days for that thing to go through. So if they are serious, let's see the LI laid before Parliament tomorrow or tomorrow next. Tomorrow is Parliament's first working day this week. So those excuses, I think, it's a matter of prioritizing this thing. You prioritize by pressing the bill through Parliament. Now it is the beef, to let it actually have the beef to work. Why should it be an excuse?
Vitus Azim, I'm grateful that you joined us. He is the former head of the Ghana Integrity Initiative. Top Story is always brought to you by Bond. It's also brought to you by Gasem Cement, the Nation Builder, Vodafone, and Nationwide. Newsnight starts right now.